Did your family have favorites? If so, were you the favorite or someone else?
You know that moment when you realize the people you've been bending over backward for, pouring your hard-earned money into their lives without a single word of acknowledgement or even a suspicion that it might be you keeping their world from crumbling, suddenly view you as nothing more than dead weight dragging them under like some forgotten anchor in a stormy lake, and instead of unleashing the fury that's been building for years through late-night transfers and skipped vacations of your own, you choose the sharpest weapon of all by staying utterly silent, allowing the next due date on those bills to rise up and scream what your voice refuses to, turning your quiet endurance into a calculated storm that reshapes everything in ways they never saw coming during those endless family gatherings where everyone pretends the cracks aren't widening. That's exactly where I found myself on that ordinary Tuesday evening in my modest Columbus apartment, the kind of place with beige walls and a kitchen table cluttered by receipts from clients who treated me like I was just another expense to minimize. As I sifted through the family group chat on my phone after a day of auditing ledgers that felt eerily similar to balancing the invisible scales of my parents' finances, when a video notification popped up from Uncle Bob. That well-meaning, but tech-challenged uncle from Dayton who still called flip phones dinosaurs and accidentally forwarded everything to the wrong people during his weekly check-ins with the relatives. I clicked play without a second thought, expecting the usual harmless clip of him fumbling with his grill at a backyard barbecue or complaining about the latest Browns fiasco that always had Dad chiming in with his gravelly laugh. But what unfolded on the screen was far from lighthearted, showing my father, Harold Thompson, seated at the worn oak table in their suburban Ohio kitchen, the very one I'd anonymously paid to update 5 years ago when the cabinets started sagging like his spirits after the factory layoff, his face flushed from what looked like a couple of beers too many, gesturing emphatically toward my mother and Uncle Bob as he slurred out those devastating words that sliced through the air like a rusted blade, declaring loud and clear that she's nothing but a burden, Evelyn, always sticking her nose in where it doesn't belong, acting like we can't handle our own mess without her handouts, and in that instant, the room around me seemed to tilt, my coffee mug forgotten on the counter as the realization crashed over me that he was talking about me, his own daughter. The one who'd spent the last 12 years wiring money from my account to theirs through discreet online services to cover everything from mortgage shortfalls to unexpected medical copays, all while maintaining the facade that it was just good fortune or a vague family fund keeping them afloat so they could hold on to that Midwestern pride Dad clung to like a life raft. It wasn't just the betrayal that hit hard, though that alone would have been enough to make my chest tighten with a mix of rage and that old, familiar hurt from childhood days when he'd blow off my school plays to nurse a pint at the corner bar with his buddies, prioritizing escapism over the everyday realities of raising a family. No, it was the layers beneath it all, the way I'd sacrificed my own stability after the divorce at 42, packing up from the house I'd shared with my ex and relocating closer to them in a deliberate move to become the safety net they pretended not to need, especially after my brother Mark hightailed it to California for some tech startup dream, leaving me as the sole pillar in our Thompson lineage to shoulder the weight without complaint or credit. I juggled their utility bills during those brutal winters when the heating costs spiked and Dad's pension barely covered the basics, slipped extra funds for Mom's endless yarn hauls that turned into those scarves she sold at craft fairs to feel useful, even cleared that nagging credit card balance from Dad's impulse buys on fishing gear he never used, all pulled from my salary as an accountant where I pinched pennies for myself just to keep their lights on and their dignity intact, convincing myself it was the right thing because that's what you do in families like ours, where loyalty runs deeper than blood and resentment simmers just below the surface like a pot left too long on the stove. Staring at the frozen frame of Dad's dismissive wave, my thumb hovered over the reply button in the chat, visions flashing of unloading the full ledger of my contributions right there in text form. Every transaction timestamped and totaled to shove in their faces the truth of who the real burden had been all along, but something sharper took hold, a sly resolve born from years of being the invisible fixer, deciding instead to let the words hang unspoken and turn my silence into the first stroke of revenge by simply not responding, deleting the video from my end and watching as the notification lingered unanswered like a ghost in the conversation thread. To test the waters of this new path, I logged into the banking app right then, my heart pounding with a mix of nerves and that forbidden thrill of reclaiming what was mine, and redirected the upcoming water bill payment, the one due in 2 weeks that I'd always handled on their behalf, straight back into my own savings account, feeling a wry chuckle bubble up at the absurdity of it, like I'd just played a cosmic prank on the family ledger. Watching my balance nudge upward for the first time in ages instead of vanishing into their void, a petty but satisfying mini-revenge that whispered promises of more to come if they kept underestimating the woman who'd been holding their world together. The evening wore on with me pacing the living room, replaying the video in my mind while the autumn rain pattered against the window, stirring up doubts about whether this was strength or just the start of a messy unraveling. But before I could dwell too long on the what-ifs, my phone vibrated with an incoming voicemail from Mom, her voice trembling slightly over the line as she mentioned how the household expenses were piling up again faster than expected and wondered if I might swing by the house soon to chat about it all. The unspoken plea hanging heavy in her words and pulling me right to the edge of that cliff where my silence was about to meet their reality head-on, leaving me to wonder just how far the ripples from this one accidental video would spread before everything I'd quietly built came undone in a wave of overdue notices and long-buried truths. Waking up the morning after that video revelation felt like emerging from a fog where every shadow hid a new layer of the family secrets I'd been propping up without even realizing how deep the foundations had cracked as I shuffled to the kitchen in my robe, the coffee maker gurgling like an old friend offering temporary solace while I stared out at the gray Columbus skyline, replaying not just Dad's cutting words, but the entire decade-plus of my life that led to this point of quiet rebellion against the role I'd carved out as the unseen guardian of their financial peace. It had all begun subtly enough after Dad's layoff from the auto plant 12 years back, when the pension checks started shrinking faster than the job market in our Rust Belt corner of Ohio, and I'd taken it upon myself to monitor their statements from afar using the online banking portals I'd set up under the guise of helping with taxes, slipping in those anonymous transfers through a service that masked the source, so they could attribute the windfalls to everything from lucky rebates to forgotten refunds, preserving Dad's stubborn insistence that he could handle things without turning into one of those welfare types he ranted about during holiday dinners. Mom's side hustles with her knitting circles had faltered as her hands grew stiffer with age, turning what was once a charming hobby into a source of frustration that I'd quietly offset by covering the yarn supplies and even the booth fees at those local craft fairs where she'd sell a handful of scarves to neighbors who pitied her more than they admired the work, all while I balanced my own books as an accountant for small businesses that demanded precision but offered little in the way of raises, meaning my vacations were always postponed and my savings grew at a snail's pace, yet I told myself it was worth it for the peace of mind knowing they weren't facing foreclosure or skipping meals in that house full of memories from my childhood, the one with the creaky porch swing where Dad used to spin yarns about his glory days on the assembly line. But now, with the sting of being labeled a burden still fresh, I spent the day at work dodging the pull of old habits, my mind wandering during meetings as I resisted the urge to log in and preempt their next bill, instead channeling that energy into a subtle probe of Uncle Bob's slip-up by crafting an email that masqueraded as innocent family chatter, asking about his recent visit to their place and slipping in a question about what Dad had been venting about lately, the kind of casual inquiry that wouldn't raise alarms, but might coax out the context behind that drunken tirade. His response arrived by midday, a rambling reply full of typos and excuses about the wrong chat group, but buried in the middle was the twist that made my stomach twist tighter. He admitted Dad had been on a tear about family meddlers ever since spotting irregular deposits in their account statements a few months back, suspecting someone was dipping in to fix things without permission, which explained the resentment bubbling under his words in the video, turning my acts of love into perceived intrusions that fueled his prideful paranoia. And darn if it didn't feel like a punch to the gut, realizing my careful anonymity had backfired into suspicion rather than gratitude in the eyes of the man I'd bailed out of more tight spots than I could count. Humor crept in as I pictured Uncle Bob fumbling his phone like it was a live grenade, his well-intentioned blunders always stirring the pot at family reunions where he'd dominate conversations with tales of his glory days in sales, oblivious to how his loose lips amplified every grievance. And in that moment of wry amusement, I decided on a mini revenge that matched his carelessness by replying with a link to an article on the perils of family gossip in tight-knit groups, framing it as just something I read that made me think of us Thompsons. A clever jab that exposed his role without direct accusation, leaving him to stew in the implication while I savored the small satisfaction of turning the tables ever so slightly on the chain of mishaps that led to my heartbreak. The afternoon dragged on with clients nitpicking deductions in ways that mirrored the endless justifications I'd made for my parents' spending habits. From Dad's occasional splurges on lottery tickets that never paid off to Mom's impulse buys at the dollar store that added up like unnoticed leaks in a roof, and by evening, as I settled into my routine of microwave dinners and mindless TV, the redirected water bill payment from the night before showed up confirmed in my app, a tangible shift. That brought a chuckle at the thought of their surprise when the due date passed without the usual mysterious reprieve, essentially forgetting to cover it in a way that let the shut-off notice serve as my unspoken retort. A petty but pointed reminder that the burden could lift itself when pushed too far. Peace settled in briefly, the kind that comes from reclaiming a sliver of autonomy after years of self-imposed servitude, but it shattered with the insistent ring of my doorbell just as the sun dipped low, pulling me to the peephole where I saw Dad standing there unannounced, his truck idling in the driveway with that familiar dent from the '98 fender bender I'd quietly paid to fix. His expression a mix of determination and discomfort that hinted at the demand brewing behind his gruff exterior, forcing me to open the door and invite him in while my mind raced with the possibilities of what fresh crisis had driven him 2 hours from their suburb to my doorstep. The air between us crackling with the weight of all the unsaid transactions, and the cliffhanger of his arrival hanging like a storm cloud ready to unleash whatever truth or plea would test my resolve next. Seeing Dad loom in my doorway like a specter from our shared past, his coat dusted with the first hints of evening chill and his eyes carrying that mix of bullheaded resolve and underlying weariness that I'd come to recognize as the hallmark of his factory-hardened life, pulled me immediately into the familiar dance of hospitality masking the storm brewing inside me after the video's betrayal, as I stepped aside to let him enter my cramped living room where the scent of cooling coffee still lingered and the cushions on the couch bore the imprint of my solitary evenings spent poring over ledgers that now felt like echoes of the ones I'd managed for him from afar. He shrugged off his jacket with a grunt that spoke volumes about the tower drive from their suburb, settling into the armchair across from me without waiting for an invitation, his calloused hands fidgeting with the brim of his faded ball cap as he launched into the reason for his unannounced visit, explaining in that gravelly tone honed from years of shouting over assembly line noise how the old truck had thrown a rod on the way back from the hardware store, leaving him stranded with a repair bill that the mechanic quoted at $700 he didn't have lying around. And while he framed it as a temporary hitch in their otherwise stable setup, the way his gaze flicked to the floor betrayed the deeper desperation that had driven him here, seeking out the daughter he'd so casually dismissed as a burden just days earlier in that ill-fated video. I listened as he rambled on about the indignities of getting older in a world that moved too fast for men like him, the social security checks that barely stretched to cover the rising premiums on their health insurance after Mom's last flare-up with her arthritis, and how he'd been too proud to ask outright before but figured family was for times like these when the system failed the folks who'd built it, his words stirring up a potent cocktail of sympathy and resentment in me because for all his bluster, I could see the cracks in his armor, the slight hunch in his shoulders from that recent back tweak he'd mentioned offhand, the way he winced when shifting position, painting a picture of vulnerability that tugged at the threads of loyalty I'd woven into my life since the divorce left me untethered and ready to anchor myself to their needs instead of my own fleeting dreams of travel or even a modest remodel of this apartment that still felt like a way station rather than a home. It was in that moment of hesitation, as I poured him a mug of the fresh brew to buy myself time while my mind raced through the mental tally of how many such crises I'd averted anonymously over the years. From the time their furnace quit in the dead of winter and I'd routed funds to the HVAC guy posing as a rebate program to this very truck repair that now stared me in the face demanding a direct confrontation, that I felt the disagreeable pull of my old habits resurfacing, considering for a split second resuming the flow of money just to ease the immediate pain etched on his face, a choice that would prolong my own burden and likely invite more of the ingratitude that had fueled the video rant, yet one that whispered temptations of restoring the fragile peace I'd maintained by being the invisible fixer in our Thompson tapestry. As the conversation meandered toward lighter ground, him cracking a half-hearted joke about how the truck was older than me and twice as stubborn, eliciting a reluctant chuckle from me at the absurdity of our shared gene pool's penchant for mechanical unreliability, he let slip a detail that twisted the knife deeper, mentioning offhand how Mom had been on edge ever since Uncle Bob's accidental video forward, her nagging him about keeping such thoughts to himself because Sarah doesn't deserve that after all she's done, confirming in that casual aside that she'd not only witnessed the full extent of his drunken dismissal, but had chosen silence on it too, complicit in the hurt by protecting his ego over addressing the truth of my contributions, a revelation that shifted my wavering sympathy into a sharper edge of betrayal, making me question how many other family whispers had circulated behind my back while I toiled away in solitude to keep their roof over their heads. The visit stretched on with him lingering over a second cup, sharing anecdotes from his VFW poker nights that skirted too close to the gambling edges I'd later learn more about, but in the spirit of that growing conflict, I opted for a mini revenge that carried a witty sting without derailing the moment entirely, excusing myself to the kitchen under the pretense of checking on dinner leftovers and instead quickly making an anonymous online donation to the local community center's fund for struggling veterans, not theirs specifically, but a rival group's outreach program that Dad had always griped about as show-offs stealing our thunder, effectively siphoning what would have been earmarked for their aid into a cause that poked at his pride while salving my conscience with the illusion of continued generosity. A clever redirection that left me smirking inwardly at the irony of helping others at their indirect expense. He departed eventually with a vague assurance that he'd figure out the truck somehow, clapping me on the shoulder in a gesture that felt more perfunctory than paternal, driving off into the night with taillights fading like the last threads of my illusions about unconditional family bonds, and I was left alone again with the echo of his vulnerability clashing against the fresh wound of Mom's knowledge, the atmosphere thick with uncertainty about whether my resolve would hold or crumble under the weight of what I'd glimpsed in his eyes. That fragile equilibrium shattered later that evening as I scrolled through emails trying to unwind, my phone buzzing insistently with an incoming call from Mark, my brother whose West Coast life had kept him at arm's length from these dramas until now, his voice crackling over the line with an urgency that demanded attention as he accused me outright of hoarding information about Dad's finances and playing the role of secret benefactor without ever looping him in, dropping the shocking bombshell that he'd been aware of some of my transfers through a shared banking alert he'd set up years ago and was now flying in to confront the whole tangled mess, leaving me stunned on the couch with the receiver still warm in my hand and the cliffhanger of his impending arrival promising to drag every buried resentment into the light where my silence could no longer hide. Mark's accusatory call from the previous night echoed through my thoughts like a persistent alarm as I tried to focus on the stack of client reports at work the next day, his words replaying in loops about how he'd pieced together my secret transfers through some overlooked banking alert he'd activated back when we were still on speaking terms more regularly, turning what I'd always viewed as my private lifeline into a point of sibling contention that now had him booking the earliest flight from San Francisco to Columbus, determined to hash out the family finances in person before what he called the whole Thompson empire crumbled under Dad's denial. The drive to pick him up at the airport felt loaded with anticipation and dread, the highway signs blurring past as I gripped the wheel tighter, wondering if his intervention would force my hand in resuming the payments or expose the full extent of the video betrayal to someone outside the immediate circle, especially since Mark had always been the golden child in Dad's eyes, the one who'd escaped the Rust Belt grind for Silicon Valley success, while I stayed behind to patch the holes. A dynamic that bred its own quiet resentments over the years, like the way he'd send holiday cards with glossy family photos, but rarely followed up with actual help beyond the occasional Venmo for Mom's birthday. He emerged from the terminal looking every bit the coastal transplant in his slim-fit jacket and jeans that probably cost more than Dad's monthly grocery budget, pulling me into a hug that felt more obligatory than warm before launching into the details during our ride back to my apartment, explaining how Uncle Bob had spilled the beans about the irregular deposits during a recent phone catch-up, confirming Dad's suspicions and painting my role as overstepping rather than life-saving, which stung because it echoed the burden label from the video while ignoring the context of how I'd stepped up when Mark's career took off and left him too busy for these home-front battles. We barely unpacked his suitcase before diving into the meat of it over takeout pizza at my kitchen table, the cheese stretching like the thin threads of trust between us as he laid out the shocking underbelly of Dad's financial woes. Not just the everyday shortfalls I'd covered, but a hidden gambling habit that had reignited after the plant closure. Starting with innocent VFW poker games that escalated into online sports bets on everything from the Bengals' slim chances to horse races at the local track, racking up debts that Mom had concealed by quietly selling off family heirlooms like Grandma's silverware set and the antique clock from the living room mantel. Items I'd assumed were misplaced during one of their half-hearted decluttering attempts rather than pawned away to plug the holes Dad's addictions dug deeper each month. Hearing it spelled out like that humanized the mess in a way that complicated my resolve. Dad's pride no longer just stubbornness, but a shield for shame that made his drunken rant seem less like outright cruelty and more like the lashing out of a man cornered by his own vices. Yet it also ignited a fresh wave of fury at the web of lies they'd all spun to keep me in the dark while benefiting from my ignorance. Mark admitting he'd wired a few thousand sporadically over the years, but pulled back when it felt like pouring water into a sieve, leaving me as the unwitting full-time banker in this dysfunctional operation, a role that now felt as disagreeable to maintain as it was to abandon, especially with the crisis looming as he described the latest overdraft alerts pinging their accounts and Mom's increasing anxiety over potential collection calls. Midway through our tense discussion, Uncle Bob's name lit up my phone with an incoming video call, his face appearing flustered on the screen from what looked like his cluttered garage workshop, and, before we could wave him off, he launched into a confession that twisted the knife further. Not only had he forwarded the wrong video, but he'd accidentally shared screenshots of Dad's betting app history with the family chat months earlier, sparking the argument that led to the rant and inadvertently outing the gambling secret to anyone paying attention, including apparently Mark, who pieced it together from the timestamps. His blunder amplifying the chaos like tossing gasoline on a smoldering family fire, while he bumbled through apologies about meaning to send it to a buddy for advice instead. In the midst of that revelation, with Mark pacing the room and muttering about how we needed to stage an intervention before things hit rock bottom, I felt the pull of a controversial choice crystallizing, opting to withhold any immediate funds even as Mark pressed me to front the cash for an emergency buffer, my silence during this unfolding crisis a deliberate stand that prioritized my emotional recovery over their material salvage, a decision bound to rankle listeners who might see it as abandoning vulnerable parents in their hour of need rather than the necessary boundary it represented after years of one-sided sacrifice. To inject a bit of witty revenge into the mix without derailing the fragile progress, I casually mentioned to Mark over the remnants of our meal a rumor I'd overheard at work about a distant Aunt Clara, Dad's estranged sister from back east, supposedly leaving behind a modest inheritance in her recent will that might trickle down to the Thompsons if the paperwork cleared, planting the seed of false hope that had him lighting up with calculations about how it could cover the arrears, a sly fabrication designed to stir internal scrambling and buy me time while they chased shadows, chuckling inwardly at the irony of dangling a carrot carved from thin air to distract from the real storm of unpaid bills gathering force. The evening wound down with Mark crashing on my couch, talk turning to tentative plans for confronting Dad together, but the atmosphere hummed with uncertainty as I lay awake listening to the city hum outside, the growing conflict between loyalty and self-preservation weighing heavier with each passing hour. Until my phone buzzed in the dead of night with a frantic text chain from Mom detailing the latest blow. The mortgage servicer had issued a formal notice of delinquency with eviction proceedings underway if the overdue payments totaling 3 months weren't settled by the end of the week, thrusting us all toward a cliffhanger where the due dates I'd once manipulated now loomed as impartial judges ready to evict not just my parents from their home, but the illusions we'd all clung to about what family really meant in the face of such unraveling truths. The eviction notice from Mom's frantic late-night texts served as the final catalyst that propelled us into action the very next morning, with Mark and I piling into my car before the coffee had even cooled, the weight of impending loss hanging over us like a shroud as we sped toward my parents' suburban home where the familiar ranch-style facade now seemed fragile against the backdrop of overgrown lawns and the foreclosure shadow creeping closer with each unchecked due date that I'd deliberately allowed to lapse in my quest for a revenge born from silence rather than screams. Arriving there felt like stepping into a pressure cooker ready to blow. Dad out front wrestling with a ladder against the gutter he'd been meaning to fix for months, while Mom hovered in the doorway wringing her hands over a stack of unopened mail that undoubtedly held more red-stamped demands, her eyes lighting up with a mix of relief and suspicion as we pulled up, quickly ushering us inside to the living room. Cluttered with the remnants of their life together, from faded photo albums on the shelves to the old recliner where Dad would nurse his aches after VFW nights, where the air thickened immediately with the unspoken accusations that had been simmering since the video's accidental reveal. We settled into an impromptu family summit around the coffee table scarred from decades of use, Mark taking the lead with his measured tech bro diplomacy by outlining the gambling debts and hidden sales of heirlooms he'd uncovered, prompting Dad to shift uncomfortably in his seat and mumble defenses about how it was just a phase to blow off steam after the plant, his pride cracking under the scrutiny, but refusing to shatter fully as he deflected blame toward the economy and those blood-sucking banks that preyed on hardworking folks like him, a narrative that glossed over the personal choices while Mom nodded along in quiet complicity, admitting she'd stayed silent on the video because families air laundry in private, Sarah, you know that. Her words landing like a gentle slap that reignited my inner turmoil over whether my years of anonymous payments had been pure altruism or a subtle bid for control in a dynamic where I'd positioned myself as the indispensable fixer, a twist that made me question my own motives even as the group turned expectant eyes toward me for the financial lifeline they'd come to rely on without ever naming it. Uncle Bob joined via speakerphone from his garage, his voice tinny and apologetic as he owned up to the full chain of his blunders, the forwarded video, the betting slips mishap, even a forgotten email chain where he'd speculated wildly about the mystery deposits being from a shady loan shark rather than a daughter's quiet generosity. His confessions stirring a brief ripple of dark humor in the room as Mark quipped about how Bob's phone mishaps could qualify him for a comedy special, eliciting a reluctant chuckle from Dad that eased the tension just enough to keep the conversation from exploding, yet it couldn't mask the growing conflict as the reality of the piled-up bills forced into the open, with the mortgage servicer calling mid-discussion to confirm the 3-month delinquency and warn of sheriff involvement if not rectified by week's end, turning the abstract revenge I'd plotted through withheld wires into a tangible crisis that tested everyone's breaking point. In that charged atmosphere, my choice to maintain silence on my role felt profoundly disagreeable, the audience likely bristling at how I held back even as Dad's face paled at the eviction specter and Mom's voice cracked with pleas for just one more time to make it right, my internal debate raging between the satisfaction of letting the due dates articulate the betrayal and the gnawing guilt of watching vulnerability expose itself in ways that humanized their flaws, yet I stuck to vague nods and suggestions about budgeting apps or community resources, a stance That prolonged the discomfort and invited blame to circle back toward me as the absent daughter who'd moved on while they suffered, all while the subtle clues I'd dropped earlier, like casual mentions of self-reliance seminars, hinted at the void where my help used to flow without fanfare. As the call ended and plans tentatively formed around Mark fronting a partial payment from his savings to stall the foreclosure, while Dad promised to seek counseling for the gambling, the climax unfolded in a raw exchange where Dad pulled me aside to the kitchen, his hand heavy on my shoulder as he grumbled a half apology for the video words, admitting he'd suspected my involvement all along but resented it as a reminder of his failures rather than a gift, a revelation that flipped the script on the burden narrative and suggested my payments might have fed into a cycle of dependency I'd unwittingly perpetuated for the emotional leverage of being needed, leaving me to ponder if the revenge was as empowering as it felt or just another layer of the family's scarred interplay. The day wrapped with a fragile truce, hugs exchanged amid promises of weekly check-ins and Mark extending his stay to oversee the paperwork. But as I drove home alone that evening with the sun setting low over the familiar Ohio fields, the ambiguity settled in like dusk. Had my silence truly spoken for me, forcing a reckoning that might heal the rifts through hard truths, or had it merely buried resentments deeper under the weight of partial salvages and unspoken costs? With Mom's occasional calls in the months that followed carrying hints of stability, but no overt gratitude, Dad's gruff updates laced with lingering pride, and my own life inching toward independence yet shadowed by the what-ifs of whether family ties are worth the endless tug-of-war or better cut loose to let everyone stand on their own, a thought-provoking void that lingers long after the bills are paid, inviting you to wonder what line you draw when the ones you've carried finally demand you drop the load.